There you go. Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. And then let's see if I can share my screen.
Okay.
All right. Sharing.
Okay.
You see?
Yep. Mhm.
All right. So you can see, okay, I see that. Let me hit present. Okay. All right. Let's see if I can. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Good afternoon. All right. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to try to see if I can see myself and everybody here. Okay, I think I'm good to go.
Okay, cool. So I am, there's a ton of people at the event. 1 second. Hi, everyone. Please head over to the sessions tab to join the event.
I'm not sure if audio will work. We can try it. Hello, Kelly from New York.
Sessions tab on the left. So I can see over 100 people are in here, but there's only 41.
40.
Yeah. So
Yep.
I think everybody's in the event area. So we'll wait for them. I'm sure everybody's scrambling, clicking on the sessions tab. All right. There you go. Hello.
Hi, Siva.
For those who are in here, we'd love to hear where you guys are from. So if you can just drop in the session chat where you're dialing in from, we'd love to hear it. Oh my gosh, Corey, we have somebody dialing in from Hong Kong and it's 2 a.m.
Well, hopefully I don't let the Hong Kong person down.
They were like, it's totally worth it. No pressure, Corey.
No pressure.
Too funny.
Queens, Sacramento, Istanbul. Wow, you might have the award
awesome.
right now for furthest away. Is there anybody further than Istanbul from California as our point of interest right now? All right. Keep seeing folks join in over from the events to session.
Think, oh, Corey, Celine wants to know where you're dialing in from.
Yes. Oh, London. Wow. Hi, Celine. I am currently in San Jose, California, originally from Connecticut. So originally from the East Coast. So all the East Coast folks, whoop, whoop, shout out to everyone on the East Coast. And thanks for dialing in from Houston. Hopefully you're staying cool. It gets pretty hot and humid and sticky out in Texas.
Let's see. Okay, it's 11:05, and so I'm going to go ahead and kick off this session. We are really, really excited about today's session. Again, if you're just joining, definitely let us know where you're dialing in from, as we would love to see where students are at around the globe. Wanted to welcome everybody to the URX Talent Development Program. My name is Shar, and I'm the Executive Director of URX. It is such a pleasure to present our speaker today because he's such a great colleague and friend of mine. And I am just so excited that he's joining and also presenting today's workshop because I think it's so important as we head into the fall season and many of you will start up interviewing again. So I'm really excited to welcome Corey Twitty, who's the head of UR at Lyft. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and pass the mic over to Corey.
Well, thanks a lot for the introduction, Shar, and it's obviously always a pleasure to work with you, and I'm so grateful and fortunate that we've been able to get to know each other over the last year plus. But I'm really excited to talk about interviewing today. It's definitely something that can be scary, it can be vulnerable, a lot of unknowns about, what are they really assessing? How did I do? And so hopefully at the end of this workshop, I'll be able to equip you with some tools, some tips, some tricks for you to help better prepare and feel comfortable going into the interview process. So in general, the type of presenter I am, if we were in person, I'd love for it to be a two-way conversation. So as much as you can, we'll definitely have time for questions at the end, but if there's something that resonates, or if there's something that really stands out, feel free to drop it in the chat. All right, let's see if I saw something. Double click to make it bigger. Hopefully you guys can see that. All right, so today we're going to go through several different parts of the interview. We're going to talk a little bit about the research and what you can do beforehand to really walk into that interview ready to go with a lot of information about the company. We'll talk a little bit about preparation and what you can do to best prepare to put your best foot forward. And then lastly, we'll talk about the interview itself. We'll talk about, during the interview, we'll talk about some tips and tricks post-interview to follow up and hopefully, again, give you some more tips and tricks to feel comfortable in that two-way conversation. This is an area and this is a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about, as this is something that's going to be happening throughout your entire career. And it's such a pivotal part in how you interact with companies. And I think that the first thing that I would say, and it's so key to remember, is that interviewing is a two-way street. And as much nerves as you might have going into an interview, you're interviewing them just the same they're interviewing you. So always remember that it is a two-way street. So I love videos and I like to have a little bit of fun. I don't know if the sound is gonna work, but we'll give it a shot. I'll hit play. If you can't hear it, just drop that in the chat and then we'll just move on to the next part. But this is a movie clip from the movie The Internship. And it makes me laugh around the different types and styles of interviews. And so hopefully you don't show up like this in your interviews. Can we hear it? Okay, thank you for the feedback. It's choppy and no video, so I just encourage you all to take a look at the movie clip from the Internship. Oh, Amanda, I wish I could do a voiceover, but I would embarrass myself quite a bit. So we'll move on to the next slide. Oh, that's a good. I can drop the link afterward. All right, so let's jump in. So why behavioral-based interview? Often known as structured interviews. But the behavioral-based interview for employers and candidates really allows for consistency across all candidates. More than ever, it's so critical to ensure that we have not only an equitable interview process, but it's inclusive for all candidates. Whether you're introverted, whether you're extroverted, no matter the type of person you are, it's so important that there is consistency across all candidates, meaning that employers will ask the same questions to everyone. By having these structured interview questions, it better prepares not only the employer, but also reduces bias throughout the conversation. When you have structured interview questions, it also allows you to have objective criteria on job-specific tasks. So many of you are probably familiar with the brain teaser questions made famous by, some Bay Area tech companies, as well as consulting companies. Your question around how many ping pong balls can you, fill in a Boeing 747? How many ice skating rinks are there in the state of Minnesota? Throughout my career, and even as an interviewee, and I think back to my collegiate career, I did have questions like that. And I just remember thinking to myself, how on earth is this measuring my ability to actually deliver on job specific tasks? And so, though one can make an argument that says, hey, well, it tests thought process, but I think most importantly, the science really and the research really shows that more structured job related questions yield better success. And then lastly, past performance. These questions are really allowed to or aimed at building past performance, which oftentimes is a strong indicator of success. I say that also in the same vein that it's not the only indicator of future success, but it is a strong indicator. And we all know from a behavioral based question, they have the famous line, tell me about a time when. So first part, there's a lot of information on these slides, but I really want to make sure that I share with you not only how I personally prepare, but also many of this is based off of thousands of interviews that I've conducted throughout my career over the last 10 years, and really what stood out from those top candidates and top interviewees. So first and foremost, as you're building your story, and really building into the company that you're interviewing, it's so critical that you understand the why. What is your personal why? It's so important that you have a clear understanding of this and why you want to work there. I also recall going, in my collegiate career when I was thinking about, which companies I wanted to work at, and I have this very vivid memory of I was talking with all my friends, and at the time, this was when consulting and banking was really the industry to be a part of. So whether it was Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or Deloitte, and I just remember being like, yeah, I really want to work at those companies. And there's a little bit of FOMO there. There's a little bit of fear of missing out on, what and herd mentality of, herd mentality of everybody going in that same direction. And I immediately thought to myself, yeah, that's what I want to do. And then I remember sitting in the interview and the interviewer asking me, why do you want to work here? And quite honestly, I think in that moment, I was like, I don't. I think I'm only doing this because of all my friends are doing this, and I think it would be a cool place to work. So it's so important that you really look deep within and reflect as to why you want to work at the company that you're applying for. If you've done this well, your passion and excitement, which are really key parts of the interview, will be evident. The next piece about your research, and when I sort of assess companies around that I want to be a part of, I look at three things. I look at the company direction and health. I look at culture and people. And then I take a strong evaluation and assessment of the actual role or the work that I'll be doing. And so below, there's some tips that you can, and things that you can do to understand more about the company direction and health. So podcasts, many companies are starting to put out podcasts about their work, what they're doing, what's going on in the business. 10K reports, right? These are investor reports that you can really understand, and many are public about what's going on in the business, what are the strengths, what's going on in that particular quarter. So though it's a heavy read, you'll get a lot of really great information, and oftentimes kudos from your interviewer from going above and beyond to look a little bit further into the company's sort of financial direction and report. YouTube, Instagram, leveraging your social channels, right? Those are going to be really great vehicles for you to look into the company. You'll look at Google News, the stock performance. If you look at the stock, that's also there's often news related to the fluctuations of the stock if it is a publicly traded company. So you can take a look there. Lena, I think Crunchbase, any of those news bases are really, really great avenues to look up more information about the company. Also looking at culture and people, right? This is a big one. This is a big one for me. And so LinkedIn, right? It's okay to creep. Sometimes your interviewers will give you their names before you interview. Look them up, connect with them, see what their experience has been, see how they got there. What path did they take to reach the and them questions about their journey, because everybody has a unique story, and that helps build more credibility and rapport with your interviewer. Right, pulsing alumni. That's another really great way to find out more about the culture and the people. And then look up on LinkedIn employees in that function that you're interviewing for. Oftentimes folks will take sort of a blind shot or blind arrow into LinkedIn to ask them what it's like to work at that company. However, it can be very different and specific based on the actual function or role that you're in. So it's really important to get some insight into your specific function by looking at people that work there. And then lastly, there's sites like Blind, Glassdoor, Comparably that will all give you unique company reviews and insights into what it's like working there. Personally, I don't like to go too heavy in either of these sites, but I like to look at all three of them for a real 360 view of what it's like to work at the company. And then lastly, this one's often overlooked, but the job description. Sometimes you might get reached out to for a role, or sometimes it's not readily available. So when it's not, it's so important to ask, because the job description will give you key insights into what are the core competencies for that role. And so as you're preparing, which we'll talk a little bit about and a little bit later, you'll understand the core competencies and success metrics for the job that you're able to build your interview stories and examples around, and to showcase what transferable skills you have that it relates to that job. And then lastly, right, I talked a little bit about this in the people, but your interviewers, right? Who are they? What makes them tick? What skills do they have? Also, seeing if there's any mutual connections, right? And leveraging those mutual connections to say, hey, can you tell me a little bit about Shar? I'm interviewing with her next week. Or, hey, can you tell me a little bit about whoever that might be and what makes them tick? What's important to them? So that research is all really important and totally acceptable when you get interviews lined up. So Ashley, great question. If the company isn't in the best health or is publicly going through something at the time of the interview, do you recommend bringing that question up for discussion? Personally, I would. I think that it's so important for you to have a macro strategy and perspective into the health of the company. And oftentimes what you read in the media might not be the actual case of what's going on internally. So that information would be really important to me. That would help influence my decision if I wanted to accept that job or not. And so that's a question that if it's really important to you, Ashley, around, closing the deal and getting you to accept, I think you should ask that question in the interview. Okay, we'll move to preparation. So this one is arguably, the most important part of the process. Interviewing is a learned skill. It's not something that you wake up overnight and you're like, yeah, I'm a great interviewer, or people are just born to be naturally strong interviewers. And so that preparation piece is so critical. So as I mentioned before in the last slide, it's so important to understand what the company values are, what the core competencies of the role is, and then lastly, what skills are needed for success. Depending on the company that you work on, and as an interviewer, be it at Lyft or Intuit or Target or any of the former places that I worked, we really wanted to understand first and foremost, especially at the entry level roles is do these candidates and do these students align to our company values? And we put more of an emphasis on values over skills, because one of the things that we really thought through was, look, you're coming in an entry-level role. We can teach you the skills needed for success. Yes, you have to have a baseline understanding of, XYZ programming language, or if you go into a sales or marketing role, you need to have X amount of marketing acumen. But those are things that can be learned over time. The values is something that is really deeply intrinsic to who you are, and is much more difficult to change over time. So how you persevere, how you show up through issues of ambiguity or boldness, teamwork, collaboration. Those are values that, again, much harder to build and develop over time. And so that's why we really took a firm and heavy assessment of. And I'll give you a little bit more color about that in the next couple slides here. But some ways that you can get some more insight into the values, right? The company website, the job description, as I mentioned, asking your recruiter, right? Asking your recruiter, hey, what are the company's values? What are the values that stand out that candidates demonstrate? Oftentimes, people don't fully leverage their recruiter as another resource in the process. And oftentimes there's, yes, in the very beginning, there is an assessment type relationship between your recruiter and yourself. But after you get through that first interview screen or that first process, your recruiter then turns to your advocate. Your recruiter, think of your recruiter as an agent through the process. And oftentimes your recruiter is a key advocate for you in the process. And again, as a former recruiter, I wanted to actually set my candidates up for success and was rooting for them through the process. So really focus on building a strong relationship with your recruiter. But the reason why point number one is so important is this is how your interview will be scored or will be assessed. Each question ladders up to a value, to a competency, or to a skill. And so the more that you're able to frame your mind into, okay, what question am I being asked? So tell me about a time that you had to navigate a difficult situation with a peer, right? At the baseline, the question really wants to get at teamwork and collaboration. So as you're forming your answers, as you're thinking about that, always take a step back and pause to say, which value or competency is this question asking me? And based on your stories, which we'll talk about, how do you overemphasize that element of your story? So let's move into that. Let's talk about power stories. These power stories should be stories that you create that have high scope and complexity. A way to think about this is, if you weren't in XYZ example or scenario that you're sharing, would that have still been done? Would that outcome still have been achieved if you weren't present? And if the answer is yes, then maybe you reconsider and you think about an example or a story that you played a larger role in, and you played a more critical piece of the puzzle, right? Complexity. Was this a 1 week project? Was this a 1 day project? Was this a 6 month project? Was this a year-long class or case study that you worked on? So really thinking about the scope and complexity. And if you don't have, something that's highly deep in complexity or scope, how do you think of a balance of attributes or things that you learned through that example? So talking a little bit deeper about power stories, you want to have 5 to 7 stories that address archetypal workplace themes. If you can figure out, number one, the values and the competencies and skills, you should structure your stories around that by company. But if you don't, it's important to have these larger, workplace themes that employers always ask questions about, right? Things like leadership, things like conflict resolution, integrity, decision-making, teamwork, communication, how you're able to think analytically. These are all stories that employers will ask you about. And so having 5 to 7 stories, not per, but each. And maybe if decision-making is a towering strength of you, you can have 2 stories that highlights your ability to make strong decisions. It's also important, as you structure these stories, that you structure them in the STAR format, which we'll talk about. And then as you think about this, most often your interviews are no longer than 30 to 45 minutes. So and each interviewer typically asks you 3 to 4 questions. And so it's really important that your stories hover around the 5-minute mark, because you don't want to run out of time. And then the last piece, I see a lot of great questions, and I'll pause as soon as the slide's over to talk a little bit about questions. But practice, 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 right? This is really going to be your bread and butter. And again, good interviewing tips aren't built overnight. And so you should continue to practice whenever you have the opportunity to do so. So first piece about practicing, don't wait until you have an interview to start preparing. The same way that you wouldn't cram for the most important final of the semester that's worth 70% of your grade, you shouldn't wait until the last minute to start preparing for interviews. And so I recommend that you continue to do this through time. And even if it's weekly, if it's monthly, whatever that might be, do what you need to do to make sure that you show up the best you can for that interview that might be your dream job. Because the reason why you want to be so practiced is you never know when that dream job or dream opportunity will come up. And you don't always have, you can't always afford saying, hey, I'll take that interview next week or the week after. Sometimes you have to be ready and prepared to interview in a day or 2 days. So it's important that you are always sort of cultivating the skill over time. So practice over video, right? In this next stage is going to be over video and virtual. And I don't know about you, but when I look at myself in video, it's a bit awkward. It's a bit uncomfortable. So the more you're able to get comfortable with yourself in front of the camera, the better that you'll be. And then video it and record it yourself, right? If you don't have somebody to practice with, videotape yourself going through your examples and going through your stories. You might be able to identify some opportunities for yourself. And so I think that's another great way at really understanding how you show up over video. Okay, so some good questions here. Thank you all for jumping in. Okay, so the first piece is, what are your thoughts on cultural fit versus cultural ad? If I, as an applicant, am aware that I'm a strong candidate to be an ad, how do I speak to this in the interview? Ash, I think that's a really phenomenal question. When I coach interviewers internally and listen to hiring reviews, we should always be talking about cultural ad. The reason for that is cultural fit will continue to build a homogenous environment and non-diverse environment if it's only, do they fit in with us? We should be thinking about how every candidate adds something additive to the culture. And so if you believe that you're a strong candidate to be an ad, what is that skill set? What are those things that you believe that you're adding? And so I would highly recommend layering that into your power stories when you are preparing for your interviews. How to get better at interviewing. So Nikisha, how to get better at interviewing if your recruiter doesn't give you feedback afterwards? That's a really great question. Not every company has a policy that they can give you feedback. And so what I would recommend, or what I would suggest, is if you have mentors, if you have friends, if you have people that you trust, offer, hey, are you willing to mock interview with me? Are you willing to allow me to practice? So leveraging people that you know and people that you trust is one way of doing it. If there's a professor or career services at your school, that might be a really great way to practice and get some feedback. And then lastly, again, no, it's not always comfortable, but videotape yourself and really take a strong assessment of your personal skills to see, hey, if I was giving myself feedback, what would I tell myself? We'll get to Lily and Jocelyn. I know you have some questions. We'll keep going, and then we'll revisit those questions toward the end of the presentation. All right, so as I was mentioning, right, skills, values, competencies. This is often how your interview questions and responses are scored. This is an example of something that has been used in the past. And as you can see, we leveraged 2 skills and then had very specific criteria and details on how we were to say, okay, how do we assess design craft? How do we assess, are they customer inspired? And the more candidates were able to show examples from those bullet points listed, the higher that interview question was scored. And as you can see, there was 4 values, but I cut one off just for space. But as you can see, there's a higher weight on values over skills, because design craft and customer inspired is something that can be taught and learned over time. Your ability to be passionate, your ability to learn fast, your ability to win together are more innate, though can be grown and changed. But those are aspects or elements of the values that we put a lot of weight on in my previous experiences. Okay, so folks sometimes have questions about, okay, well, all right, I got my power stories. I'm thinking about how to now practice them and how to memorize them. And so my first recommendation for you all as you're writing down these stories, and what I've found personally helpful, is I used to write out these long paragraphs of these interview questions or a leadership example or experience. And earlier on in my career, I found myself fumbling through the process to remember and to really hold on to every eloquent word that I thought through. And I was like, wow, in my mind, this sounds right. And in the early days of when I would interview, I would trip over my words because it wasn't exactly how I wrote it down in this paragraph format. And, you know, I oftentimes found myself just kind of confusing myself and trying to really present a robotic, perfect example. But what I realized over time is that I need to help myself and better tell this story. You know, I know this story better than anybody else. And so I should be able to write it out and say, if I went home and I told my partner or my spouse or whoever, the same way that you would tell them is how you should be telling your interviewer, right? And so as we think about the STAR method on how to write this down, you want to highlight the situation, right? And again, we'll go a little bit deeper into this, but you want to highlight the situation and about a bullet, like, here was the key situation, here was what happened, it took place over this, you know, amount of time, and our task was to XYZ. Then talk about your thought process or your actions taken, right? And so highlighting how you think through things and how you have at least 4 different actions, 3 to 5 actions are what you want in an example that demonstrates high scope and high complexity. And then lastly, your results, right? Quantitative if possible, but if you don't have a quantitative result, you can layer in a key learning. Something that I also recommend to students is as you think through the result, if you said, hey, and as a result of all my efforts, we saved the team lots of time. It's okay to make don't lie, but it's okay to make an estimate to say, hey, as a result of our efforts, we were able to save approximately 20% of time, allowing us to do X, Y, Z. So that's something else that you can put in your back pocket. And as you see this written out here, and why I have it this way is to bullet point it out. Instead of writing a full paragraph, bullet point out very high level, okay, what happened? Okay, action 1, action 2, action 3. That will allow you to be more succinct and concise as you retell these examples. Okay, so Catherine, you asked about the DIGS method. So the STAR method is one method of many, right? So there's the STAR method. There's the SBO method, which stands for situation, behavior, outcome. Catherine, I'm personally not familiar with DIGS, so if you want to drop that in the chat, that would be great. But I'm sure it's similar, but would love to hear exactly what the DIGS method is, as I'm still learning quite a bit as well. Do you recommend some examples for STAR method? Munir, I'd ask a little bit more about what exactly you mean from an example perspective, and maybe you can drop that in, or we'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end of the presentation. But feel free to drop something in there now. So how do you evaluate for talent, right? So we look at past behavior, which is very much the behavioral-based interview process. One of the things that I think worked really well at Intuit when I previously worked there was a portfolio review. So we'd ask candidates to tell us about a proud project, right? So these are all things that you've done in the past that demonstrate either the current skills or transferable skills for that role that you'll be interviewing for, right? So that's the past behavior piece. Then you have the current behavior piece, right? Which are things like technical interviews, case studies, references, things like that. We're not going to spend much time talking about the technical interviews or case studies. That's a whole nother topic that we could spend an entirety of an hour plus on talking through that. But this is specifically focused on the STAR, the behavioral-based interview process. So we talked a little bit about this, right? But what does STAR stand for? It stands for situation or task, right? What was the situation? What was the task at hand, right? Thought process. How do we demonstrate your thought process? Through your examples. What were you thinking about? What were your motivations? How did you influence people, right? These are all critical pieces of information to then understand what your actions were. And then lastly, which I often see a lot of candidates miss this step because you're so passionate, you're so excited about the story that you're telling that you miss the result, right? Which is this last piece. And what tends to happen, it's almost like for your interviewer, it's like, wow, I went through this amazing story, this amazing example of courage and passion, but I don't know how it ended. It's like watching a great movie with a cliffhanger at the end. So it's really important to make sure that you layer in your results. So quick question here that I'll pose to the group. What percent approximately of your answer do you think you should focus on talking about the situation or the task? Feel free to drop it in the session chat. Okay, 5%, 60%, 10%, 10%, 10%. That seems 25%. So we see a lot of different variants here, but this is my personal opinion, 15, 20%. But from an interviewer, this is what I've sort of seen as that right balance of success, which is about 10 to 15% of your answer should be giving high level context on the situation and the task. And oftentimes this can be somewhat of a misstep for candidates. I know I personally have suffered from this, where I get so wrapped up into, let me tell you every detail, what happened, who was there, what day it was, how I was feeling, when really what your interviewer really wants to know is your thought process and the actions that you took. So I'll ask another question to the group. What percent of your answer do you feel that should be focused on your thought process or the action? Drop that in the chat. 30%. Okay, thank you, Lena, Ankita. Lots of folks, 50, 60, 40. Great. Love the participation. Great. Yeah. So from what I've seen, about 70 to 80% of your answer, right? Again, depending on the situation, depending on what happens, how you set it up. But ultimately, this is really to demonstrate the majority of your answer should focus on your thought process and your actions, right? We want to know what you were thinking, how you influenced others, and then what actions you specifically took. And it's okay. There's no right or wrong answers here. We're all learning together. So appreciate everybody putting themselves out there and helping add to some participation for the session. So thanks for all of the great thoughts and feedback here. And then lastly, right, result. We're all probably steeped in math in some way, shape, or form. So I won't ask you about the result, but about 10 to 15% as well could be around your results. Obviously, depending on where you spend your time, this should obviously add up to 100%, but 15, 70-15, that's a great model as well. But it's just important that, the key takeaway is that you spend the majority of your time talking about your thought process and the actions that you took. Yes. So Anne, great question. Can you expand on the thought process and how is that different from the actions, right? So an example of this could be like, I had, in my last job, I had a task around whether or not we should change all of our salary packages for our entry-level talent. And so the first thing that I was thinking about, as a talent acquisition leader, was how does this position us in relation to our peers? So that was one of the key considerations that I was thinking about through this example. I also was thinking about, as a former recruiter, how important compensation is to entry-level students as we're moving into a time of lots of uncertainty. And I was thinking about how much students are going to prioritize compensation. And so the first thing that I did was I set up a meeting with our comp team to understand all of the historical compensation for all of our new grads over the last 3 years. So that's a little bit of an example to show the difference between thought process and action, right? You may have an example that you're working with a peer or a partner and you're like, hey, I was having a lot of challenges with a peer. And the first thing that went through my mind was, is there something else, or is there an external factor that's affecting this person's ability to be a member of our team? And so after I thought through that, the best piece of action and the best thing I needed to do was set up one-on-one time with him or her to talk a little bit more about how they're not contributing to the team and meeting the expectations that we talked about before we kicked off the project, right? So that hopefully that answers your question. Another question from Janani or Janini, sorry if I've mispronounced your name, is what do you think about presenting the solution action first and then expanding on the process you took to achieve it? The solution would be the hook. I think that I think that's an interesting approach, and I think that as long as you're able to talk through what you did to achieve that solution, I think that could actually be a really interesting way to present, to say, to start with, the result. I think for me as an interviewer, I tend to operate more sequentially. So to understand what happened first, what was, the introduction, then the body of the paragraph, then the conclusion. But in some instances, I'm sure there are ways that you can start off to get your interviewer reeled in with the solution. But I really probably put that back down to personal preference. I see some good questions here. What are some alternative ways to present the results if they aren't necessarily quantitative? I think that Andrew, that's a great question. And you're not always going to have quantitative results. Sometimes the beauty and the best result of your story could be a key learning, could be something that you learn, that you understand, that you're going to take forward moving forward, or take with you moving forward. So for example, and as a result, though we weren't able to complete the project on time, the key learning or the key insight that I took away with was the importance of proactive communication and bringing other team members along the journey with me. And so coming out of this experience and moving forward, I will always, seek to understand first before jumping into my actions to complete any given task. So that's a way, Andrew, that you can layer in a key learning or insight about for a result if you don't have one. Or you can make an estimate, sort of as I mentioned a little bit earlier, approximation of how much time it saved, or you potentially increased efficiency by 10 or 15% by doing some simple math when you prepare. All right. Great questions. We'll keep going, and then we'll make sure that I'm almost done, and then we'll open up the questions probably around the 10 to 12 minute mark. So for the interview, so important to share passion. I really want to see how passionate people are, not only about the company, but also about their own experiences. Because if you're not passionate about what you accomplished, then who is? Who should be? And so that passion piece is really important. And I would highly recommend making sure that what you're sharing, and you don't have to be overly extroverted, but how do you showcase your passion is really critical. Eye contact and body language. I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel there's a casual nature and casual element to being on video. And so sometimes I find myself sitting back, or I have my leg up, or I'm slouching. And so it's so important that you really think about things like your posture, things like how you're turned to the camera or away from the camera. And sometimes many of us have many different screens, many different monitors. But if I was delivering this presentation and I was looking over here the entire way, it would be harder for you to connect with me. And so when you're really trying to make a point that you want to emphasize, things like leaning into the camera, things like looking directly at the green dot if you have a MacBook, or the white dot if you have a PC. But looking directly into the camera when you're trying to make a really critical or pivotal point, I think really brings you closer to your interviewer, or to the interviewee. And so it's important that you make eye contact, or camera contact, as I would say. And then the last part, pause. It's okay to, when you get a question, to pause and think about it. I think that it feels that time of the pause feels much, much longer than it actually is. But it's okay to just pause, process the question, and then answer. And lastly, pro tip, if you get stuck, if you really can't think of it in the moment, you can ask your interviewer, can we revisit that question? Can we move to the next question? That's perfectly okay and well within your sort of rights as a candidate to do that. Okay, some quick common pitfalls. We'll wrap this up soon. But things like, that's never happened to me before, right? With these behavioral based questions, and hopefully the company asking you these questions, they're broad enough that it's not, tell me about a time on a Wednesday when it was raining that you solved the complex project. So really think about what the question is. And so I bring you back to this tip about, if you get a question that you don't understand or you don't know how to answer, ask your interviewer to rephrase it or reframe it. That's something that you can do. Another thing that you can think about is revert back to the values, revert back to the competencies, revert back to the skills, and try to think about what is the general theme that this question's getting at. And if you're able to do that, though your example might not be exactly answering the question, you'll still get to a point where you can deliver on the competency that's being assessed in that question. Speaking of hypotheticals, right? So if you get a question, well, in general, I would do this, or I approach these situations like this, or how I lead is like X, right? Give a specific concrete example. Too much context, right? We talked about this, too much detail and situation. And then lastly, right? And overall, like the result was, the project was great. Everything was great. It was a success. It's also okay to share examples that the result might not have been successful, and what you learned through that. That's just as important as delivering some amazing outcome for the project. Okay, lastly, interviewing is a two-way street, right? You're interviewing them the same way they're interviewing you. Make sure that you have questions to ask. There's so much you don't know about the company on the outside. And so always was a little bit of a red flag when I asked candidates, do you have any questions? And they're like, nope, no questions. I was like, how do you not have questions? If you were passionate about working here, you'd have lots of questions. So make sure that you take the time to ask questions, and then don't just ask a question to try to sound smart. Ask a question that you actually really care about. So that's my bit there. be cognizant of time. Everybody in this new work from home environment are always jam-packed. So be thoughtful about time. And then inquire about next steps. And it's so important to follow up, whether it's with a thank you, an email, a text, however that might be, but to showcase sort of gratitude and appreciation through the process. And then specifically following up with your interviewer about something that stood out to you in the conversation. So thank you for your time. Really enjoyed getting to know you. And in particular, I really enjoyed us talking about XYZ. So that's all I have. I know we have lots of questions. Some we got to in the chat, but happy to pause and then open it up for questions.
Hi.
I see you joined us, Shar. Okay, so some other questions. So let me scroll back up. Okay, there's some good ones in here. Okay, we answered that one. We answered this one. All right, so we'll move to, should the situations we talk about be professional? So this is from Maggie, and thank you for your question, Maggie. Should the situations we talk about be professional experiences, or can it also be non-professional ones? My personal advice here would be use your best judgment, right? Thinking back to the competencies, the skills, the attributes that your interviewers are going to be assessing. Does a non-professional example demonstrate that ability? And so in some cases, yes, absolutely. A non-professional, non-work related question or experience can definitely answer, right? It could be school projects. It could be, whether it's being in a business fraternity, if it's a group project, whatever that might be, those are all examples that you can share if you don't have an internship or formal work experience. So you can certainly share that, but use your best judgment. I find that candidates have, in my experience interviewing lots of college students over time, can kind of get in a rabbit hole when they turn overly personal. So I would just caution you about that and thinking about what the question is asking. Okay, Jocelyn, when we are asked about a weakness of ours, what type of response does the recruiter expect to hear? So this is always one that's top of mind for a lot of people. And I can tell you what we don't want to hear, which is I'm too much of a perfectionist, and I work too hard, or actually I don't really have a weakness. Those are, believe it or not, those are all examples that people have shared with me as I've interviewed. But I think the one I hear most often is I work too hard, or I'm overly I'm a perfectionist. Really, what you want to think about in this example and what you share is, what is a real opportunity that you have, and what steps are you putting in place to mitigate those weaknesses or those opportunities? In the same vein, if the job that you are applying for, if you're applying for a sales job and communication is going to be paramount, your weakness should probably not be communication. And so think of different sort of things that you truly are working on, but what are you putting in place to better mitigate those weaknesses? So, for example, something for me that I've worked on in the past is really around prioritization and even how to delegate. Right, they go hand in hand, and so. And I try to give examples of, here are the things and how I'm working on prioritizing. So whenever I get a task upfront, I ask the person, what is the time sensitivity of this? I tell them the other things that I'm working on. I leverage my peers, my managers, other mentors to help talk through how I should be prioritizing those tasks. So this is Gayatri, and sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, but I always tend to overshare during interviews. What should be the ideal time to talk about an experience? So I'm not fully sure what you're asking. If you want to add a little bit more clarity, I'm happy to answer it. But how I interpret that is And I too get really excited about these examples and things I like to share. But try to, when you practice, time box your answers to anywhere between 5 to 6 minutes, and really practice hitting your stories on time. So you're not spending 10, 14, 15 minutes. I, as an interviewer, have had to stop candidates and interject to say, hey, I really appreciate everything you're talking about, your passion, but I have everything I need for this story. So let's move on to the next part. So if you get to be in that 5-6 minute mark, right, that allows 4 questions and then 10 minutes for the end if it's a 30-minute interview. So that's something that a tip that
Corey,
I
hate to interrupt, but I thought it was a really great segue since we were talking about time, and we have about 4 minutes left in our session. But I just wanted to thank you so much for such thoughtful insights. And I think this session, I actually walked away learning some new things as well. And so I really appreciate that. I hope the students who have logged in really appreciate it. I want to thank you, the students, for the awesome engagement. And I know that there were a number of questions that were coming in. I'm sure that Corey would be okay if we sent him LinkedIn messages if your questions weren't asked. So I welcome you to definitely do that. Just wanted to note that every session we do select a winner for the resume review with a member of our URX community. And this week it actually happens to be Corey Twitty. So we're really excited. And I wanted to congratulate Celine Lowe for winning this week's raffle. So you will receive an email soon connecting you both. Okay. Thanks so much for coming. You'll receive an email interest form so that we can send your information to Lyft. And also, we'd love to just hear your feedback on our session. And I'm sure that Corey would love to hear some feedback as well. Next week's session is with Figma on design. So you will also be sent the registration link for that session. Okay. Corey, any last thoughts for the group?
No, that's it. I just wanted to thank everybody for your time. Everybody is super busy, and time is so precious. And we oftentimes vote with our time. So thank you for investing in yourself. You're one step closer to again, that self-improvement. And so thank you for your time. If you do have questions, as Shar mentioned, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll try my best to get back to folks, but you'll have to give me a little bit of time. But if you have feedback on the session, or if there's something that resonated most, drop it on LinkedIn. Tag URX on something that you really learned through this process, and how you've grown and committed to your own self-development. So again, thanks again, and look forward to hopefully
Bye, everybody.
meeting
Have
some
a
of
good
you in the
rest of your
future.
week.